In 1987, a French archaeologist opened a burial shaft at Saqqara that hadn't been touched in over 3,000 years. Inside, he found coffins, offerings, and the remains of a man buried with full honors, the kind reserved for the most powerful officials in Egypt. The titles carved beside the body read Vizier, Chief of the entire land, Father of the God, the second most powerful man in Egypt under one of its greatest pharaohs. But the name on the tomb was not Egyptian, it was Semitic. This man, whoever he had been before Egypt claimed him, had entered the system as a foreign captive, and he had risen to a position that native-born officials spent entire dynasties trying to reach. His tomb tells us he made it. It does not tell us what it cost. I've been sitting with this one for a long time, because the closer you look at it, the less it fits the version of Egypt most people carry around in their heads. This isn't a story about a slave who got lucky. It's about a machine, an enormous, ancient, perfectly organized machine, and two men trapped inside it. One who rose through its center, one who never left its walls. Every episode, we go where the textbooks stopped. Subscribe and come with me. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'm always curious how far these stories travel. The Nile Delta. In the 14th century BCE was not a border in the way we think of borders. It was a membrane. Porous, busy, soaked in commerce and suspicion and the smell of marshland. Traders crossed it carrying cedar resin from Byblos, copper ingots from Cyprus, lapis lazuli that had traveled overland from Afghanistan through a chain of hands no single merchant could trace. Diplomats crossed it, carrying clay tablets pressed with cuneiform, the lingua franca of Bronze Age politics, sealed inside clay envelopes that were themselves sealed inside leather pouches. Soldiers crossed it, dragging captives roped at the wrists, catalogued by age and skill before they'd even cleared the eastern frontier. And somewhere in that traffic, a boy crossed it too. We don't have his name, not his original name, the one his mother used. What survives is what Egypt made of him. Aper-El, a Semitic construction, bent into Egyptian phonetics but never fully absorbed by them, the way a stone holds the shape of the water that carved it without becoming water. The name sat inside the Egyptian language like a foreign body the system couldn't quite digest, and for reasons no one recorded, the system let it stay. I need to be careful here, because the instinct, mine included, is to turn this into a story about one exceptional man who beat the odds. That framing is comfortable. It's also wrong. Aper-El didn't beat anything. He was processed. He entered one of the most efficient human sorting machines the ancient world ever produced, and the machine decided he was useful. Here's how that machine worked. When Egypt's new kingdom pharaohs campaigned in the Levant and Nubia, and they campaigned constantly because the empire's economic model depended on it, they brought back people, not as an afterthought, as a core objective. The annals of Thutmose III, carved into the walls at Karnak in meticulous columns, list human captives alongside cattle, grain, and gold. The accounting is precise. 7,000 prisoners from Megiddo. Over 80,000 foreign people relocated during a single reign. These figures may be inflated, pharaonic numbers often were, but even at half their value, they describe a system that consumed foreign populations on an industrial scale. The captives were sorted at intake, age, physical condition, language skills. The strong went to quarries, agricultural estates, temple lands. The young were more interesting to the administration. A child who could learn Egyptian, who could absorb the scribal curriculum and still remember the sounds of a Semitic or Hurrian tongue. That child was a tool the empire could sharpen. Not every foreign child was selected. Most vanished into estate labor, their names reduced to head counts on papyrus ledgers that were themselves recycled within a generation. But some were pulled into the palace system, cupbearers, attendants, translators in training. Boys placed close to power not because anyone valued them, but because proximity was the first step in a long, quiet transaction. The transaction looked like this: forget where you came from. Learn our script, worship our gods, or perform worship convincingly enough that the distinction doesn't matter. Dress as we dress, eat as we eat. Let the system remake you completely and without remainder, and in return, we will let you climb. And the boy climbed. But I want to hold that thread for a moment, because there was another life beginning at roughly the same time, under the same pharaoh, inside the same system, and this one started with no climb at all. On the west bank of Thebes, cut into a narrow valley between limestone cliffs that trap the heat like the walls of a kiln, there was a village, Deir el-Medina. It housed the men who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, along with their families, and it was, by the standards of Bronze Age labor settlements, remarkably well provisioned. Stone houses with multiple rooms, grain rations delivered on a regular schedule, access to a kind of medical care, or at least to practitioners who had read the medical papyri and could recite the remedies, which in the Egyptian system amounted to roughly the same thing. The village was also a cage. The workers didn't choose to live there. They were assigned. Their movements were tracked on daily attendance rolls, ostraca marked with red and black ink, noting who showed up, who didn't, and why. Penub was absent, brewing beer. Seba did not come. His mother was ill. Kemwaset was stung by a scorpion. These notes were administrative, not compassionate. The state needed to know where its labor was, the way a workshop foreman needs to know where his tools are. A boy born in this village, and boys were born here constantly, because the workforce renewed itself through inheritance more than recruitment, knew his future before he could speak. His father cut stone, his grandfather cut stone. He would cut stone. The scribal schools that might, in theory, have offered a different path were available to a different class of child, in a different part of Egypt, behind walls this boy would never see. I've handled some of these ostraca, not the originals from Deir el-Medina, but comparable pieces from later periods, the same rough limestone, the same iron oxide ink that still holds its color after 3 millennia. They're lighter than you expect, almost casual in the hand. And the handwriting on many of them is surprisingly fluid, which tells you something the official record doesn't advertise. These workers were literate, not in the formal, monumental sense of temple scribes who carved hieroglyphs into granite. Literate in the daily sense. They could write letters, file complaints, compose prayers, draft contracts for the sale of a donkey or the terms of a divorce. They had voices. The system just wasn't designed to listen. The boy in the village would grow up to carve corridors inside the earth, painting gods and spells on walls that were never meant to be seen by the living. He would know the most sacred spaces in Egypt more intimately than any priest. The exact curve of a burial chamber ceiling, the texture of plaster that hadn't fully dried, the way torchlight moved across a painted figure of Osiris at 3 in the morning when the shift was long and the air tasted of chalk. And the foreign boy in the palace would grow up to govern the system that sent this worker underground. They would serve the same pharaoh, breathe the same air in some cosmic sense, the same Nile-fed, silt-heavy, incense-layered air that circulated through the two lands like a single exhalation. They would never meet. They would never know each other existed. But the machine that held them both was one machine. This is where the two threads begin to run. From here forward, the episode moves between them, not to manufacture a connection, but to show how the same architecture shapes lives at different altitudes. The palace and the tomb, the advisor and the worker, the man who rose and the man who stayed. The Egyptian scribal curriculum was not an education, it was an installation. A boy entering the palace school, whether Egyptian-born or foreign, did not learn to think, he learned to copy. Hour after hour, day after day, seated cross-legged on the floor with a reed brush and a palette of red and black ink, he reproduced passages from texts that were already ancient. The instructions of Amenhotep. Do not be arrogant because of your knowledge. Consult the ignorant as well as the wise. The satire of the trades, which mocked every profession except the scribes. The washerman's hands are never clean. The soldier's body is covered in wounds. The fisherman is blind to the crocodile beneath him, and concluded that only the scribe lives well. The message was not subtle. Every text a student copied reinforced the same architecture. Hierarchy is natural, obedience is wisdom, and the man who masters the written word sits above the man who works with his hands. The curriculum didn't argue this, it assumed it, and by the time a student had spent 5 or 6 years copying these passages until his fingers cramped and the words had worn grooves into his memory, the assumption had become invisible. It was just the shape of the world. For a foreign-born student, the process carried an additional weight that no Egyptian boy had to bear. The texts were saturated with references to Ma'at, the principle the Egyptians believed governed everything from the movement of the stars to the behavior of a junior scribe in the presence of his superior. Ma'at was order, Ma'at was truth. Ma'at was the reason the Nile flooded on schedule, and the reason a son should obey his father, and the reason the pharaoh ruled. In their understanding, it was not a human invention. It was the fabric of existence, woven before the first dynasty, maintained by ritual and obedience, always under threat from its opposite, Isfet, chaos, the formless dark that pressed against the edges of the ordered world. To absorb this system, a foreign student had to do more than memorize vocabulary. He had to internalize a cosmology that explained his own subjugation as a feature of the universe's design. The fact that he had been taken from his homeland, separated from his family, and deposited in a palace school was not, by the logic of Ma'at, an injustice. It was order asserting itself. The strong kingdom absorbs the weak. The center holds the periphery. The system sorts, and the sorted obey. I've read the training texts dozens of times. What strikes me is not the ideology, every civilization has one, but the elegance of the delivery. There's no coercion on the surface, no threat. Just these calm, reasonable maxims about wisdom and humility and knowing your place, copied by small hands that had no choice about being there, in a language some of those hands were still learning to form. And the student who copied well, who absorbed the script, the grammar, the cosmology, the posture of deference that the Egyptians called silence and valued above almost every other quality, that student moved forward. Not by rebellion, not by talent exactly, by disappearance, by becoming so thoroughly Egyptian that the foreignness was buried under layers of acquired behavior, like a stone foundation beneath a painted wall. Aper-El copied well. 700 kilometers south, in the village between the cliffs, a different kind of education was happening, and it involved no texts at all. The tomb workers' sons learned their trade the way stonemasons have learned it in every civilization that has ever cut rock, by watching, then by doing it again until the motion lived in the body and the mind could wander while the hands kept working. The father showed the boy how to hold a copper chisel at the correct angle against limestone. Too steep and the stone shatters unpredictably. Too shallow and you waste hours scraping instead of cutting. He showed him how to read the grain of the rock, because limestone has a grain invisible to anyone who hasn't spent years with it, and cutting against it will ruin a wall that took a week to prepare. There was no written manual for this. The skills passed through demonstration, repetition, and the occasional sharp correction when a boy's attention drifted and a chisel slipped. The Deir el-Medina Ostraka record some of these apprenticeships in passing, a father requesting that his son be assigned to his own work crew, a complaint that a boy was not yet ready for the deeper corridors, but the training itself left no curriculum. It was stored in muscle memory and handed down like an inheritance that couldn't be taxed. And yet these workers were not illiterate brutes laboring in ignorance. This is one of the persistent distortions in how we talk about ancient labor, and the Deir el-Medina evidence demolishes it completely. The workers read, they wrote. They composed letters of startling sophistication, legal arguments about property disputes, petitions to local officials couched in the formal language of bureaucratic complaint, love poems that played with metaphor and double meaning in ways that suggest not just literacy, but literary awareness. One Ostracon contains a passage so close in structure to the Song of Songs that scholars have debated whether it reflects a shared poetic tradition across the ancient Near East, or an independent flowering of the same human impulse. These men could write. What they couldn't do was use that writing to leave. The scribal profession, the one Egyptian career path that offered genuine mobility, required formal training in institutions the workers' sons could not access. Literacy alone was not enough. You needed the right literacy, acquired in the right place, validated by the right superiors. A stonemason who could compose a beautiful letter was still a stonemason. A palace-trained scribe who could barely write a coherent sentence, but had spent his youth in the correct school, copying the correct texts under the correct master, that man could become an overseer. The system didn't reward skill, it rewarded compliance with its own categories. The worker's son learned to cut stone with precision that would endure for millennia. He learned the proportions of the human figure as the Egyptian canon defined them. 18 grid squares from the soles of the feet to the hairline, the fist placed exactly at the hip, The stride measured to a formula that hadn't changed in 1,000 years. He learned to mix pigments from ground minerals: red ochre, yellow orpiment, carbon black, Egyptian blue made from heating sand and copper and calcium together, until the chemistry produced a color that still startles in its intensity when you see it on a tomb wall lit by a conservation lamp. He learned the names of the gods he painted and the spells he carved, absorbing through his work a theology that the scribal students learned through texts. The content was the same. The status it conferred was not. He knew the interior of the pharaoh's tomb better than anyone alive, except the men who worked beside him. He had touched every surface. He had breathed the dust of the king's eternal dwelling before it was sealed. And when the burial was complete and the tomb was closed, he walked back to the village and sat outside a house no larger than a single chamber of what he'd just built, and ate his evening ration of bread and beer, and the system called this balanced. I want to pause on something that the sources don't say, because the silence here is loud enough to be worth naming. We have Aper-El's tomb, we have his titles, we have the physical evidence of a man who completed the transformation, who entered the system as a foreign captive and exited it decades later as Vizier, chief of the entire land, buried in a shaft tomb at Saqqara, with every ritual observance the Egyptian afterlife required. What we don't have is a single sentence from him about what that transformation felt like. No autobiography survives in his tomb. Most high officials of the 18th dynasty left lengthy biographical inscriptions, carefully curated, politically sanitized, but still revealing in what they chose to emphasize. Aper-El's tomb has titles and funerary texts and the names of his wife and son. No narrative, no "I came from nothing and rose to serve the king." No account of the years between arrival and authority. Maybe the inscription was there and didn't survive. The tomb was damaged, portions of the decoration are lost. Maybe it was never carved. Maybe, and this is the possibility I keep circling back to. The story of a foreign captive's rise was not a story the Egyptian system wanted told. The system wanted the product, not the process. It wanted the Vizier, not the boy who became him. The transformation was supposed to be invisible. That was the whole point. And so the record gives us an ending without a middle, a destination without a journey. A man standing at the summit of the Egyptian state with a name that whispers to anyone paying attention that he was not born to stand there. The worker, by contrast, left fragments of middle everywhere. Complaints and prayers and sketches on limestone. A life told in scraps. No summit, no titles, no shaft tomb. Just the daily evidence of a man who existed inside the system at ground level, whose testimony survived because it was written on material too cheap to steal and too ordinary to destroy. Two educations, two men shaped by the same civilization. One learned to become something he was not. The other learned there was nothing else he could become. The Vizierat was not a reward, it was a weight. The instructions of the Vizier Rechmir, copied in his tomb at Thebes with the kind of care that suggests the man wanted posterity to understand exactly what had been asked of him, describe a role that would have crushed most modern administrators inside a month. The Vizier heard every legal dispute that couldn't be resolved at a lower level. He managed the treasury. He oversaw construction projects, grain storage, irrigation, military logistics, the appointment of regional governors, and the collection of taxes from an empire that stretched at its peak from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates. He reported to the pharaoh. Nobody else reported to the pharaoh. Everything, every petition, every complaint, every provincial crisis, every temple budget passed through one man's hands before it reached the throne. And that man, in the case of Amenhotep III's administration, carried a Semitic name. I want to hold that fact in the air for a moment without explaining it away. Because the conventional reading, the one you'll find in most survey textbooks, treats the rise of foreign-born officials as evidence of Egypt's cosmopolitan tolerance during the New Kingdom, a sign of openness, cultural confidence, the great empire absorbing the best and brightest from its conquered territories. That reading is not wrong, exactly, but it's incomplete in a way that changes everything it touches. Egypt did not elevate foreign captives because it valued diversity. It elevated them because they were structurally dependent. A man like Aper-El had no family network inside Egypt, no ancestral estate, no cousin who was a high priest at Karnak, no uncle who governed a nome in Upper Egypt, no web of obligation and alliance stretching back 5 generations. He had nothing except what the pharaoh gave him. And that meant, in the brutal arithmetic of palace politics, he could be trusted in the ways that a native-born aristocrat with deep roots and divided loyalties could not. The pharaoh didn't need advisors who agreed with him. He needed advisors who couldn't survive without him. This is the mechanism the textbooks rarely name. The foreign official's loyalty wasn't earned, it was engineered. The system stripped him of every alternative and then called the result devotion. And the remarkable thing, the thing that still unsettles me when I sit with it too long, is that it worked. For decades sometimes, for entire careers. Men who had been taken from their homelands as children grew old serving the system that took them, and the record suggests many of them served well, with genuine competence and what appears to be genuine commitment. Whether that commitment was authentic or performed or some alloy of the two that the men themselves couldn't have separated, the sources will never tell us. Aper-El accumulated titles across what appears to have been a long career. Vizier, father of the god, a title that implied intimate access to the pharaoh's person, possibly a role in religious ritual. Chief of the entire land, an administrative designation that placed him above every regional governor in Egypt. His tomb at Saqqara was built in the elite cemetery, surrounded by the burials of other high officials, and its scale tells us that the resources of the state were available to him. He had, by every external measure, arrived. But I keep thinking about the Amarna letters, that archive of diplomatic correspondence found at Akhenaten's capital, written on clay tablets in Akkadian cuneiform, documenting the frantic back and forth between Egypt and its vassal states in the Levant. Some of these letters were handled by officials who were themselves of Levantine origin, men who could read both scripts, men who stood in the Egyptian court and translated messages from kings who ruled the lands where they had been born. What does that do to a person? To sit in a gilded room and read a letter from a petty king in Canaan, begging the pharaoh for military aid, and to know that the language on the tablet is the language your mother spoke to you before you were taken, and to translate it faithfully, neutrally as your position requires, and then to go home to your Egyptian wife and your Egyptian house and eat your Egyptian dinner in the Egyptian evening. I'm asking because I don't know the answer, and I don't think the men who lived it left us one. While the advisor navigated the politics of proximity, the worker in the Valley of the Kings navigated something more immediate: stone. The royal tombs of the 18th and 19th dynasties were not small projects. The tomb of Seti I runs over 100 meters into the cliff face. The tomb of Ramesses II is shorter but wider, with multiple chambers branching off a central axis, like the roots of a tree driven into rock. These spaces were carved by teams working in shifts, a left side and a right side, each with its own foreman, its own scribe, its own daily accounting of progress measured in cubits of stone removed. The work was methodical in a way that left almost no room for individual decision. The draftsman drew the grid on the prepared wall surface. The outline scribes painted the figures according to canonical proportions. The sculptors carved the relief. The painters applied color. Each step depended on the one before it, and each was checked by the foreman before the next crew moved in. The system allowed for skill. The painted ceilings of some tombs are breathtaking in their precision, but not for initiative. You executed, you did not design. A skilled worker could become a foreman. That was the ceiling. The foreman of the left or right side of the tomb crew was the highest position a Deir el-Medina worker could reach. It came with a slightly larger house, a marginally better ration, and the responsibility of managing men who were also your neighbors, your relatives, your drinking companions in a village so small that every argument echoed off every wall. The foreman answered to the scribe of the tomb, who answered to the Vizier, that same Vizier who, in Aper-El's era, was himself a foreigner. And here is the geometry that the parallel live structure exists to reveal. The man who had been taken from his homeland and remade by the system sat at the apex of an administrative chain that terminated at its base in a village of Egyptian-born craftsmen who could not leave. The foreigner had mobility. The native had roots, and the system valued mobility because mobility meant dependence, and dependence meant control. The workers knew this, not in those terms, not as political analysis, but as the felt reality of daily constraint. The ostraca from Deir el-Medina contain petitions addressed to officials far above the village's station, and the language of these petitions is careful, formulaic, deferential in exactly the way the scribal curriculum taught. The servant speaks to his lord. "May your car be gracious." The workers had learned the grammar of supplication and they deployed it strategically. But the record also holds moments where the formula cracked and something raw showed through. One ostracon, and I've come back to this one more times than I can count, contains a letter from a worker to a senior official that begins with all the proper forms and then, midway through, drops into a sentence that translates roughly as, "I am a man like you." 4 words that shouldn't have needed saying. 4 words that the entire structure of Egyptian society was organized to make unsayable. The official never replied. Or, if he did, the reply didn't survive, which amounts to the same thing. There's a moment in the career of every high official, Egyptian-born or foreign, where the proximity that elevated you becomes the proximity that endangers you. And for foreign-born advisors, that moment carried a specific terror because the fall, when it came, could be framed not as political failure but as contamination. The outsider revealed the foreign body the system should never have absorbed. Chancellor Bey learned this. Bey was Syrian. His rise during the late 19th dynasty paralleled Aper-El's rise in the 18th, a foreign-born man accumulating power until he stood closer to the throne than almost anyone in Egypt. An inscription at Aswan, which Bey himself almost certainly commissioned, describes him as the man who established the king on the seat of his father. He was talking about Siptah, a young and possibly disabled pharaoh whose claim to the throne was shaky enough that Bey's support may have been decisive. That inscription is extraordinary, a foreigner claiming in carved stone that he made the pharaoh. The arrogance of it, or the honesty of it, depending on how you read power, is staggering even at a distance of 3,000 years. Within a few years, Bey was dead, executed. The exact circumstances are lost, but later sources, the Great Harris Papyrus, composed under Ramesses IV, refer to him as a great enemy, a Syrian who overstepped. The language is careful and vicious in the way Egyptian condemnation always was, not angry, not passionate, just categorizing. He was a threat. The threat was removed. Order was restored. I've gone back and forth on Bey's story for years now. The problem is simple and probably unsolvable. Every source that describes his fall was written by the people who destroyed him. We have the prosecution's case. We have the sentencing. We do not have, and will never have, his voice. Whether he was genuinely dangerous or merely foreign at a moment when foreignness became unacceptable, the record will not say. It will only say that the system that elevated him was the same system that consumed him, and that it did both with equal efficiency. The worker in the village never faced this kind of danger. He was too far from the center to be a threat. His risk was different, slower, less dramatic, and in its own way more total. The risk of being ground down by a structure that needed his hands and had no interest in his mind. The risk of a life spent in useful obscurity, recorded only in grain receipts and attendance lists, ended in a shallow grave on a hillside that the pharaoh never visited. Two men, two kinds of captivity. The advisor trapped by elevation, the worker trapped by flaw. The mummy of a high official tells you things the tomb inscription was designed to hide. Skeletal analysis of elite New Kingdom burials, and the data here is still accumulating because non-invasive imaging techniques have only recently made it possible to study wrapped remains without destroying them, reveals patterns that the biographical texts never mention. Arthritis in the spine and knees, consistent with decades of seated work on hard surfaces. Dental abscesses that would have caused chronic, sometimes debilitating pain. Evidence of parasitic infection, schistosomiasis, primarily carried by the Nile water that every Egyptian, from pharaoh to field laborer, drank and bathed in. The parasites didn't care about your title. Aper-El's mummy was found in poor condition. The Saqqara burial had suffered water damage over the millennia, and the remains were fragmentary. We cannot reconstruct his health in detail, but we can reconstruct the world his body lived in, because the medical papyri and the physical evidence from contemporary burials draw a picture that is consistent and unsparing. A vizier's day began before dawn. The instructions of Rekhmir specify that the vizier should open the doors of the administrative hall at first light and begin receiving petitions. The stream of business did not stop until the hall closed. Legal cases, land disputes, tax assessments, reports from provincial governors, each one carrying its own subset of problems, a failed irrigation canal in the Fayum, a shortfall in grain deliveries from a temple estate in Upper Egypt, a border garrison requesting supplies. The vizier heard them all. The vizier decided, and the vizier bore personal responsibility for every decision, because in the Egyptian system, authority and accountability were fused at every level. If the grain didn't arrive, it was your name on the failure. This went on for years, sometimes decades. The administrative record shows viziers serving for 20-30 years or longer, which means the pressure wasn't a phase. It was the architecture of an entire adult life. And for a man like Aper-El, the pressure had an additional dimension that no native-born vizier carried: the knowledge that your position was granted, not inherited, that the apparatus supporting you was borrowed, that the network of clan alliances and temple connections and hereditary loyalties that cushioned an Egyptian-born official simply did not exist beneath your feet, and that if the pharaoh's favor shifted through death, through politics, through the slow accumulation of court resentment against a foreigner who had risen too far, there was nothing to catch you. I think about that sometimes. Not the power, the vigilance, the years of watching every face in every room for the first sign of a shift you couldn't afford to miss. The worker's body tells a different story, and we have more of it. The cemeteries associated with Deir el-Medina and similar labor settlements have yielded skeletal remains that physical anthropologists have studied in considerable detail. The findings are remarkably consistent across generations. Spinal compression in the lumbar region, the kind caused by years of bending forward in low-ceilinged corridors, swinging tools in spaces where you could never fully straighten. Osteoarthritis in the hands and wrists, concentrated in the grip pattern specific to chisel work. Healed fractures in fingers and forearms. Occupational injuries, some of them multiple, suggesting not single accidents but the accumulated toll of a career spent striking bronze against stone in confined spaces where a misjudged swing had nowhere to go except into your own body. And the lungs. We can't examine lungs directly from skeletal remains, but the conditions these men worked in make the inference unavoidable. The royal tombs were carved into limestone using tools that generated fine calcium dust in enclosed corridors, ventilated only by the movement of human bodies. The workers breathed this dust for hours at a stretch, shift after shift, year after year. Modern silicosis and calciumite exposure. Studies suggest that chronic respiratory damage would have been nearly universal among long-serving tomb workers. The medical papyri contain treatments for coughing and chest tightness, honey and date mixtures, herbal inhalants. That may represent the system's acknowledgement of a problem it had no intention of solving at its source. The workers were not disposable in the way quarry laborers or agricultural serfs were. Their skills were specialized enough that the state invested in their maintenance, rations, housing, medical practitioners stationed in the village, rest days that were observed with reasonable consistency. But maintenance is not care. The system kept these men functional. It replaced them when they broke, and the ostraca record the replacements with the same neutral administrative tone used for everything else. A new name on the roster, a reassignment of housing, a note that the previous occupant had gone to his horizon. The Egyptian euphemism for death that makes dying sound like a commute. One ostracon, undated, probably 19th dynasty, found in the village dump, records a worker requesting lighter duties because his eyesight was failing. The handwriting slopes downward across the limestone flake, the letters growing larger and less controlled toward the end, as if the man was writing by feel rather than sight. The request was noted. Whether it was granted, the record doesn't say. I sat with a photograph of that ostracon for a long time before I could write about it. Not because the content is dramatic, because the handwriting is. You can see the effort in the strokes, the attempt to maintain the scribal discipline he'd practiced for decades, while the tool that made it possible was leaving him. The system trained his hands. The system used his eyes. And when the eyes failed, the system filed the complaint and moved on. But the costs weren't only physical, and this is where the record gets harder to read, because the Egyptians did not have a vocabulary for what we would call psychological damage, and even if they had, the official sources would not have used it. The advisor lived inside a performance that could never lapse. Every gesture, every ritual observance, every prayer offered to Egyptian gods in the Egyptian manner, using Egyptian words, all of it had to be flawless because the performance was the proof. The proof that the foreigner had been fully absorbed, that the system's judgment in elevating him was sound, that the membrane between Egyptian and non-Egyptian, which the entire civilizational identity depended on maintaining, even as it was constantly violated, remained intact. Aper-El's tomb contains standard funerary prayers to Osiris, Anubis, and the gods of the Western horizon. The prayers follow established formulas, the same phrases found in hundreds of elite tombs across the Memphite and Theban necropolis. There is no deviation, no personal inflection, no hint that the man being buried had once spoken different words to different powers in a different language. The funerary record presents a man who was, by every ritual measure, indistinguishable from the Egyptian-born officials buried around him. Was that erasure complete? Did Aper-El, in the privacy of his own thoughts, the one space the Egyptian administration could not reach, retain any fragment of the world he came from? A phrase, a melody, the taste of a food his mother prepared, the shape of a landscape he saw before the soldiers came. We will never know. The sources are designed to make the question unanswerable. That's not an accident. That's the system working exactly as intended. The worker, by contrast, lived inside a transparency that offered no escape in the other direction. His thoughts, his complaints, his fears, they spill across the ostraca with an openness that feels almost reckless. One man writes to a friend about his wife's infidelity with such raw fury that the limestone flake seems to vibrate with it. Another composes a prayer to Hathor so intimate in its longing that reading it feels like opening someone's diary. A third writes a letter to his dead wife. A common practice in Egypt, these letters to the deceased, placed in tombs as genuine attempts at communication across the boundary the Egyptians believed separated the living from the dead, begging her to stop haunting him, to leave him in peace, to understand that he did nothing wrong. These men were not hidden. They were exposed. The village was too small for privacy, the walls too thin, the community too tightly bound, and the emotional lives they recorded, because they could record them, because literacy gave them that one freedom the system hadn't anticipated needing to restrict, are so vivid, so immediate, so recognizably human that the distance of 3,000 years collapses in the time it takes to read a single line. The advisor left titles, the worker left feelings, and I don't know which is the greater loss. To have your inner life erased by the system that elevated you, or to have it preserved in fragments on stone flakes that were thrown in a garbage pit and forgotten until a French archaeological team sifted through the dump 3 millennia later, finding your grief between the broken pottery and the fish bones. Alain Zivie was not looking for Aper-El. The French archaeologist had been surveying the cliff tombs at Boubastion, a section of the Saqqara necropolis carved into a limestone escarpment south of the Unas Causeway, when his team broke through into a burial complex that had been sealed since antiquity. The year was 1987. The shaft was deep, multiple chambers descending into the rock, and the contents, though damaged by water infiltration that had seeped through the limestone over centuries, were substantial. Coffins, canopic jars, the deteriorated remains of mummies, and on the walls, in the painted plaster and carved relief that survived the moisture, a name and a list of titles that didn't belong together. Vizier, father of the god, chief of the entire land. Aper-El. The discovery created a specific kind of scholarly problem, not a mystery in the dramatic sense, but a gap. Here was physical proof of a man who had held the second most powerful position in Egypt under Amenhotep III, and possibly into the early years of Akhenaten's reign. His existence was now beyond dispute. His tomb was real, his titles were carved, his burial was conducted according to the highest funerary standards of the New Kingdom elite. And yet, outside this tomb, he barely existed in the broader record. No mention in the Amarna letters that survived. No appearance in the administrative papyri from this period that have been published. No biographical inscription inside the tomb itself, or none that survived the water damage, which amounts to the same frustrating silence. The tomb held his wife, Tauret. It held his son, Hui, who bore the title General, a military rank suggesting the family's integration into the Egyptian system continued into the next generation. Hui's name is fully Egyptian, no Semitic trace. Whatever linguistic thread Aper-El had preserved, deliberately or by bureaucratic inertia, his son had let it go, or had it let go for him. By the second generation, the absorption was total. The membrane had closed. I find myself returning to that generational detail more than any other part of this story. Aper-El kept his name, his son didn't, and between those two facts lies an entire unwritten conversation, a father's choice or a father's failure to choose, or a son's quiet decision to finish what the system had started. We don't get to hear it. We just see the outcome, carved in stone, one generation apart. The worker has no tomb worth naming. The burials at Deir el-Medina were modest by elite standards, but more elaborate than those of most Egyptian commoners. A rock-cut chamber, small, sometimes shared with family members across generations. A painted coffin, if the family could afford one, decorated with images of gods and protective spells, adapted from the same funerary corpus used in the royal tombs the deceased had spent his life building. Shabti figures, small servant statues meant in Egyptian belief to perform labor on behalf of the dead in the afterlife. The workers made their own shabtis or traded for them within the village. Some are finely carved, others are rough, barely shaped, the work of a tired man who knew the theology but lacked the energy for precision after a full shift underground. The afterlife, as the Egyptians conceived it, was hierarchical in the same way the living world was. The pharaoh's burial ensured a royal existence among the gods, vast provisions, elaborate spells, chambers full of everything a divine being might need for eternity. The Vizier's burial, like Aper-El's, was a step below. Generous but not royal, comfortable but not cosmic. And the worker's burial was a step below that. Adequate, functional. The minimum the system deemed necessary to process a soul through the dangers of the underworld and into whatever modest portion of the field of reeds awaited a man who had spent his living years cutting stone. The same hierarchy, extended into infinity. As the Egyptians believed, even death did not dissolve the structure, it perfected it. But the worker left something that neither the pharaoh's tomb nor the vizier's shaft could match, and it is the great irony of this story that the most enduring human legacy from the entire New Kingdom may not be the golden mask of Tutankhamun or the colossal statues at Abu Simbel, but the garbage dump at Deir el-Medina. Tens of thousands of ostraca. Limestone flakes and pottery sherds covered in ink, black for the text, red for corrections, dates, and emphasis. They were thrown away. That's the essential fact. These were not archives curated for posterity. They were the disposable paperwork of daily life. Receipts, letters, drafts, notes, sketches, laundry lists, legal complaints, dream interpretations, fragments of stories, hymns, love poems, insults, and prayers. The workers tossed them into pits the way you'd toss a used napkin, and the desert preserved them because the desert preserves everything that isn't deliberately destroyed, and nobody thought these scraps were worth the effort of destruction. What survived in that dump is, by any honest measure, one of the most complete records of ordinary human life from the ancient world. More intimate than the Vindolanda tablets from Rome and Britain. More varied than the Geniza documents from medieval Cairo. More emotionally raw than anything the official Egyptian record ever permitted itself to produce. A man writes to his son about the proper way to manage a disputed field boundary, and midway through the practical advice slips in a sentence about missing him. A woman dictates a letter, through a scribe probably, though some women at Deir el-Medina were literate themselves, accusing her neighbor of theft. And the accusation is so detailed, so furiously specific about the missing quantity of grain and the exact date it disappeared, that you can hear the anger in the syntax. A worker composes a hymn to Meretseger, the cobra goddess the villagers believed inhabited the peak above the Valley of the Kings, asking her to relieve the pain in his eyes. And the prayer is formal in structure but desperate in tone, the words of a man who has tried everything else. None of this was meant to last. All of it did, and this is where the two lives converge, not in a meeting, not in a dramatic intersection, but in the question of what remains when the system that held them both has gone. Aper-El's tomb was built to last forever. That was the function of an Egyptian tomb, to anchor the deceased in eternity, to provide a house for the Ka spirit, to ensure through architecture and ritual that the dead would endure as long as the stone held. The tomb was sealed, the prayers were carved, the offerings were placed, and for 3,000 years the system worked as designed. The tomb sat undisturbed beneath the sand at Saqqara, holding a man's titles, his family, his gods, and his name, that stubborn, Semitic, un-Egyptian name, in the dark. What it didn't hold was his voice, no autobiography. No personal statement, no account of the journey from captive to vizier, from foreign boy to chief of the entire land. The tomb preserved his status. It did not preserve him. The worker's burial was never meant to last at this scale. A modest chamber, a painted coffin, a few amulets tucked against the linen wrappings. The structure was sound but small. Within a few generations, some of these tombs were reused by later occupants, the original burials pushed aside, the coffins stacked, the identity of the first occupant effectively erased by the needs of the living. The worker's body endured, but his burial did not maintain the permanence that Aper-El's shaft tomb achieved. And yet, the ostraca survived. The prayers, the complaints, the letter to the dead wife, the love poem scratched on a pottery sherd during a lunch break, tucked into a wall niche and forgotten. The dream interpretation that a man wrote out because he woke frightened and needed to see the fear in writing before he could master it. The sketch of a cat herding geese, probably satirical, possibly political, definitely funny in a way that still works after 3 millennia. These are not monuments, they are litter, and they contain more human life per square centimeter than anything in the Valley of the Kings. I've spent over 20 years with Egyptian sources, and if I've learned one thing that I would defend without qualification, it is this. The record does not preserve what the system valued. It preserves what the system failed to destroy. The grand tombs were robbed. The temple inscriptions were recut by later kings who wanted the credit. The administrative papyri were recycled, painted over, used as fuel. What endures, what actually physically endures, is the accidental archive. The notes no one collected, the fragments no one filed, the garbage, the monuments lie. The garbage tells the truth. 2 men entered the same machine. One climbed to its center, one stayed in its walls. The advisor became everything the system asked him to become. He wore Egyptian linen, he prayed to Egyptian gods, or performed prayer with such precision that the distinction dissolved. He governed Egyptian provinces, judged Egyptian disputes, carried Egyptian titles that placed him above millions of people who had been born in the land he'd entered as a captive. And when he died, the system buried him with honors and sealed the shaft and moved on without recording his story. He was useful, he was absorbed, he was finished. The worker never left the village. He cut stone in corridors he could not own, painted gods he could only petition, carved spells for an afterlife that, in the cosmology his civilization maintained, would assign him roughly the same position he'd held in life. He filed his complaints, he wrote his letters, he threw his ostraca into the pit and went back to work. And 3,000 years later, his words are still here, still angry, still tender, still alive in a way that the Vizier's titles are not, because titles describe a function and words describe a person. And the desert knew the difference even if the system didn't. Aper-El's name survived because it was carved deep. The worker's voice survived because it was thrown away. I don't know what to call that. Justice is too clean a word. Irony is too light. Maybe it's just the way the past works, holding on to what it was never asked to keep, letting go of what was built to be permanent. The system spent 3,000 years deciding what mattered. The sand decided differently. Let me know what you want to understand next. The archive is deep.